It's the 4th of March 2007 and we're here in Fairfax, Virginia, and we're interviewing our colleague Niels Petter Gleditsch from the Peace Research Institute in Oslo as part of our Parents of the Field project. So Niels Petter, welcome to Fairfax and thank you for giving us this time to interview you. Looking back now in the sort of early days of the peace and conflict field, whatever we're going to call it, people came into the field from all sorts of different intellectual backgrounds, different disciplines. What was yours? Tell us how you entered the field when you first became interested.
I was a student of sociology, and I guess I came to peace research with a double background. One was my interest in social science, and the other one was a background in the peace movement. And of course my mentor at the time, Johan Galtung, had that same background.
Yes.
He was a sociologist, although he was a mathematician before he became a sociologist. And he'd also been active in the peace movement. He was chairman of the Norwegian War Resisters League, and I knew him from that angle. So it was this double commitment to social science and changing the world that brought me into peace research. And I wasn't in on it in Norway right from the start. I started as a student at PRIO in 1964, January 1964. So it's a long time ago, but I didn't observe the first 5 years close at hand, more from a distance. Although I knew about it, of course, from the start.
How did you first meet Johan?
I think the first time I met Johan was after I had participated on a rather long peace march, the San Francisco to Moscow Walk for Peace in 1961. I wasn't on the American end of it. I was on the London to Moscow part, and I represented the Norwegian War Resisters League in that group. And after we had completed the trek to Moscow, which is an interesting story in itself, but doesn't have too much to do with peace research, we got back to Oslo, me and a couple of the other walkers, and spoke at a public meeting. And this was when Johan was still chair of the War Resisters League in Norway, so he chaired the meeting. And I may have met him before that, but I think that was the first time I got to know him reasonably well.
So you had a background of activism and a background of interest in research. So what was there anything particular that sort of drew you into the field of peace research, of conflict research? What was there anything particular at the time that was? Well,
Galtung had actually been teaching abroad partly because of a lack of funding in Norway. So he was in Latin America for a year and a half teaching at the Faculty of Social Science in Chile. So I wasn't his student at the university. So I was doing, fairly conventional courses in philosophy and sociology and economics. But then he came back and he got funding for PRIO from early 1964, and he went out and looked around to hire 2 graduate students to work as assistants on projects, and then I was one of those 2. And I actually worked on a project on nonviolence that first year, and I haven't done much work directly on nonviolence since then, but every once in a while I'll get some letter asking me about nonviolence as if I was still an expert on nonviolent resistance.
Yes, once you get tarred with a particular label,
yes, that's right.
It sticks.
I got labelled early.
Okay. The early days, both I think in Scandinavia and elsewhere, there was a tendency to talk about the field in a sort of double-barreled way, sort of peace studies, conflict studies, peace and conflict studies. How did you think about, how did you understand the field at the time, if you can remember back to those early days?
Well, I know that there was a controversy over the name. But that was just a couple of years before I got into it myself.
Okay.
Johan Galtung in the 1950s, when he wrote about peace research, would always refer to it as peace research. But many other academics, even those who were sympathetic to what he was doing, thought that peace research sounded too idealistic or not sufficiently scientific, and argued that it should be called conflict research. And so the compromise when the PRIO was first founded, it was called the Section for Peace and Conflict Research of the Institute for Social Research. By the time I started in January 1964, the name in Norwegian became Peace Research Institute. And so there was a gradual change. And when the Journal of Peace Research was founded, also in 1964, it was called Journal of Peace Research and not Journal of Conflict and Peace Research. And I know that this same discussion went on in other places, because you take the Journal of Conflict Resolution, which is in many ways quite similar to the journal that I edit, Journal of Peace Research, and was founded a few years before. I've heard from people who were involved at that early stage that they did not dare to call it a Journal of Peace Research. Fortunately, that left the name open for us. Nonetheless, of course, we knew that the study of war would be an important part of peace research. I mean, some of the pioneering work by Richardson and Quincy Wright and so on was, after all, about finding patterns in war. But always with a view to looking at how you could reduce war or end it.
The distinction between peace research and conflict research still seems to exist, almost as though they're two subfields. Do you think there are any real major differences between the two, or are they just?
No, I don't see those as two different fields. I find still in peace research that we spend a great deal of our time studying war, and fortunately today we are in a position where we can see that war seems to be waning, that the number of armed conflicts is declining, the number of battle deaths goes up and down, but it's also been on a long-term decline since the peak in World War II. But that's a very important part of peace research, to study those trends. I think the subfield that may stand a little apart is perhaps the one that you've been much involved in conflict resolution. That has perhaps tended to be a little bit separate from much of other peace research, but some institutions bridge the two. I think like our colleagues in the Department of Peace and Conflict Research in Uppsala. You've got Peace and Conflict Research, you see again in the name. They have a heavy emphasis on conflict resolution as well as the study of patterns in war.
So you wouldn't put yourself in one camp or the other?
No, not in that regard. And there's another terminological difference here, which reflects to some extent ideological differences, and perhaps belongs to a slightly later stage in the history. But that's the distinction between peace science and peace research.
Oh yes. Well, of course
we can go into that story at some point if you like, because it's an interesting story. Belongs more to the late 1960s, early 1970s.
Yeah. Well, we interviewed Walter Izard a while ago,
of course he was,
and he was very much on the insistent about the peace science side of things.
Well, he was the one who invented the name Peace Science and changed the name of the Peace Research Society to the Peace Science Society.
Yes, I recall. I think that he did that perhaps in the early 70s, but because I used to read the reports of his conferences as they came out, and then suddenly it had become the Peace Science Society International, and not the Peace.
Yeah, well, the background for that was that he had founded something called Peace Research Society International. Right. It was founded in the very early 1960s, at about the same time as the International Peace Research Association. And the Peace Research Society was an offshoot in many ways of the Society for Regional Science. And regional science was actually something that Walter Reichert had pretty much founded as an academic discipline. So he is in the position of having, in a sense, founded two academic disciplines. The Peace Research Society had both North American meetings and international meetings. And in the early 1960s, many of us went to these international meetings. But then they held a meeting, this was during the Vietnam War, so it was sort of second half of the 1960s, I'm not sure the precise year. They held a meeting on the Vietnam War, and many of the younger, more radical people in peace research felt that this was a conference that was sort of looking at how, or some of the papers were looking at how the US could more effectively fight the war in Vietnam, rather than looking for peaceful solutions and looking at it from the Vietnamese point of view. And so there was an international Peace Research Society meeting in Copenhagen, I think in 1969, where there was a major debacle. And
yes, I think I remember hearing about it.
Walter Reichert got roundly criticized and became rather angry. And of course, this was the time of the this was in the wake of the student revolt in 1968, and some very strong language. It was quite common among students and young radical academics to use very strong language. So this situation got polarized very quickly, and Walter Reichert's reaction was to say, I don't want to be part of this, and I want to call this the Peace Science Society. And the Peace Science Society is actually still in very good shape, and it's been able to attract a lot of good young scholars. So several of our graduate students and younger faculty go to their meetings, and pretty advanced stuff on methodology and mathematical modeling and so on.
Yes, I think I recall. I wasn't at that meeting, but I recall talking to some people who'd been there, and they said that the language became...
But this discussion, you see, didn't just go on in the peace research / peace science society. There was the same discussion in IPRA. And some of the pioneers of peace research, like Johan Galtung and Kenneth Boulding and so on, got criticized for being liberals. In many ways, of course, peace research politically had originated in opposition to the Cold War. And many peace researchers were arguing in favor of a rather symmetric view of conflict, where you shouldn't look at the East-West conflict as a matter of us and them, but as two parties, and how can you find some kind of resolution to this conflict. Now, many of the radicals at the end of the 60s felt that the most important conflict was not the East-West conflict, but the North-South conflict. And they felt that rather than taking a balanced view and looking at both sides and reconciliation and so on, you should associate yourself with the underdog. And which was very much in line with the argument of the student revolt in the universities. And this led to criticism of peace research for being too liberal. I can still remember Kenneth Boulding saying that I am not a liberal, I'm a conservative. I voted for the Nixon because he thought Nixon would end the war in Vietnam.
That's a
but Kenneth Boulding, I think, became so offended that he didn't go back to the International Peace Research Association for 20 years. And Johan Galtung reacted slightly differently. There was an article in Journal of Peace Research called Politics and Peace Research by Hermann Schmid, who was one of the young radicals. Later on, he actually left peace research and became rather atypically more of a pro-Moscow socialist, whereas many of the other radicals moved more in a sort of pro-Peking direction. But Hermann Schmid wrote this article of Politics and Peace Research, which dealt with this dilemma of identifying with the underdog and so on. And Johan Galtung wrote an article, which is still one of his more frequently cited articles, called Violence, Peace and Peace Research. And you have to search the first footnote to see that it's a response to Hermann Schmid, because it's an independent argument. But in fact, it was a response to the challenge of the young radicals. And this is, of course, where he first redefined the concept of peace and introduced this idea of structural violence and so on, which for a few years became very influential and still is among some people.
Well, I think the debate still goes on these days, particularly under the label of looking at asymmetric conflicts.
Yes.
And I think it's a sort of a grandson or a grandchild of that particular debate.
It is to some extent, but the term asymmetric conflict is sometimes used by very conservative people in the Defense Department.
Yes.
When they talk about terrorism and so on. So it's not
it's not exactly
ideological term on the left in the same way that you had in the late 1960s.
Yeah, on a tangent, what happened to Hermann Schmid? Eventually,
he
still
taught
teaching?
sociology at the University of Roskilde in Denmark. But I haven't been in touch with him for many years.
No, I remember him. I think it must have been after that whole debate between him and Johan coming to London once and giving a seminar at University College where I was.
He and Håkan Wiberg were sociology students in Lund and were close associates. And I forget what the term in English now. These two comedians were one's very tall and one's very short.
Oh, Laurel and Hardy.
Laurel and Hardy, right. They were the Laurel and Hardy of Scandinavian peace research in the...
okay. Well, I have no need to ask which was the very tall one, of course.
Håkan Wiberg is the very tall one, yes.
Yeah. Okay, going back to the foundations of the field. What do you think were some of the major intellectual influences that started to turn a very diverse set of theoretical and sometimes practically orientated studies into a field or even a discipline? And what do you think were major intellectual influences on that?
Well, first perhaps I should say that I'm not fully convinced that peace research is a discipline. I know there was an ambition to create a peace research discipline, and it's certainly a field of study, and it's more than a field of study in the sense that it has an institutionalized basis. There are journals devoted to peace studies, peace research, and so on. But I'm not sure it is sufficiently distinct in terms of a body of theory, methodology, and so on to be called a discipline. Certainly not at the level of sociology, political science, economics, psychology. But I think the ambition at the time was very much to create a separate discipline. So I used to believe in that. Now I am less certain. But that goes for a lot of things. I'm much less certain of many things than I used to be. But what were some of the intellectual influences? I think for me, one of the very important things that happened in the early to mid 1960s was that peace research became associated with what was known as the behavioral revolution in the social sciences. The use of statistical analysis and mathematical modeling and so on. And this was part of the early history of the pioneers. I mean, in particular, Louis Richardson, of course, with his models of arms races and so on. I notice now that every once in a while, young people are who are doing mathematical modeling and so on are going back to Richardson and still finding new things in his writings, were generally published only after his death.
Yeah.
Then there was also the work that Quincy Wright did and Sorokin and others who were compiling war, but that was more sort of counting than trying to model it. But of course these methods entered sociology and social sciences generally, just as they had entered economics a decade or two or three before.
Previously.
And to me that was one of the really exciting things about peace research in that period, and something that I think attracted a lot of young people to the field.
So that was one influence on your own work, but what other influences were there on you as a young peace researcher, hoping to create a new discipline? And
well, I mean, there was also the political influence, the Cold War, the threat of nuclear war, and the feeling that the traditional disciplines hadn't really contributed much to dealing with this dilemma, and that I think was another important influence for me, and perhaps as strong an influence as any intellectual influence. I can't really identify any sort of great thinker or great philosopher that particularly led me in that direction. It was more a combination of the political with the idea that, okay, we have a breakthrough in scientific methods. We're becoming more scientific than the traditional disciplines.
yeah, I remember that too.
And that was one reason why I became a sociologist, not a political scientist, because the feeling at that time was that sociology was ahead of political science in terms of new methods and so on. I think later on, perhaps as early as the 1970s, that started shifting around.
The other way.
Political science got its act together, and sociology perhaps didn't quite keep up with it. So ironically, even though I'm educated as a sociologist, now I'm a part-time professor of political science. So sometimes jokingly speak as myself as a defector from sociology.
We have an expression at our institute where people talk about themselves as being recovering. My colleague Rich Rubenstein describes himself as a recovering lawyer. So.
Right, yes.
So there you were in Prio working with Johan, Johan putting together a set of research projects, which you've mentioned, yours being particularly non-violence. How did you, I mean, you were already aware of people like Louis Richardson, presumably, and Boulding, but how did you become aware of the work of other people in the field, or indeed, other disciplines that were contributing to the field? What brought you into contact with new ideas? Well, of course,
Johan Galtung had he was only 34 in 1964 when I started at Prio, so he wasn't exactly an old man. But he had a very wide set of international contacts. He'd taught for 2 years at Columbia University in New York. He'd taught in Chile. He'd guest lectured in any number of countries. And so We kept up an active correspondence with these people, and they would come to PRIO to give guest lectures. And one of those who came early on was J. David Singer, the founder of the Correlates of War Project. So I sometimes say in my lectures that the Correlates of War Project was born in Oslo, at least intellectually born, because he was thinking about and working on it during a sabbatical. He spent half that sabbatical at the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs, which was doing more sort of traditional foreign policy analysis, and half of it at PRIO. And this was deliberate from Singer, because he thought that there shouldn't be this separation between international relations as represented by Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and peace research. He thought we should be together. I don't think he quite succeeded in that, but he was certainly an early influence.
Was Nils Orvik at the International Institute?
Nils Orvik was one of the people at the at Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and John Sandnes, who was a historian and NUPI's first director, and also for a while chairman of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee.
Why weren't you together? I mean, it sounds as though there was a definite separation and a deliberate separation, or was it just accidental, or what was David trying to bridge?
At the time, it was completely unthinkable that the two would become one institute. And this was partly methodological, because, as I said, we were into the behavioral revolution. And they were doing what we regarded as rather essayistic writings in sort of historical and semi-legal tradition. Partly it was also political, because although PRIO was not a political organization, most of the people associated with it were somehow critical of the Cold War and Norway's military alignment with NATO and the US and so on. Whereas we felt that at NUPI they were much more establishment oriented. And Nils Orvik, that you mentioned in particular, of course, was a very vocal supporter of the Western Military Alliance. Ironically, I mean, this has all changed. The current director of the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs, Sverre Lodgaard, was of course a colleague of mine at PRIO for many years, and was PRIO's director for several years. And it's actually another person who's also been director, although just temporary director at NUPI and the director of PRIO. So there's much more overlap than going back and forth between the two institutes now.
Yes, we talked to Sverre when we were in Oslo, and he made the same point actually.
Yes.
All right, so a lot of international networking through Johan and people coming to Oslo, like David. And you've already sort of mentioned IPRA conferences. Were there any other kinds of networks that you found useful at that time? Other conferences that you attended, other ways in which you started to build up a network with Europe or with the United States? Anything that you...
I think initially the peace research conferences for me were the most important places. IPRA certainly, but we also had an active Nordic peace research conference with many people of my generation, sort of born in the early to mid 1940s, and coming from sociology, but increasingly also from political science, psychology, to some extent economics. And that was probably our most important intellectual network. Then eventually we also, of course, started going to academic conferences like the International Sociological Association, the International Political Science Association, International Studies Association, and so on.
Yeah. Where there's now
but
a fairly long-standing peace studies section, isn't there? Of course.
Yes.
Now, when did that start? My memory fails me on that one.
I wasn't actually active in the International Studies Association that early, but I think it's been there for a long time. Of course, one has to realize that it's become so much cheaper to travel. In the mid 1960s, funding a trip by plane to the U.S. was, of course, very major.
Prohibitively.
It was almost the same, cost almost the same in kroner as it does today.
Really?
And you can just imagine the
yes.
the inflation has been since 1964. I personally went to the U.S. for a year to study sociology at the University of Michigan.
Okay.
And that was partly inspired by J. David Singer, although he was in the political science department.
Right.
But I took courses both in the sociology and political science departments. But I toyed with the idea of staying for a PhD in the U.S., but I decided to go back and complete my education in Oslo. But interestingly, at the time when I had a Fulbright travel grant to go to the U.S., and it was assumed that you would go by ship. So actually, I broke my arm before going over. So they let me fly Icelandic, which was the cheapest way you could fly at the time.
Of course.
Going back took a full 10 days from New York to Oslo, which is quite astounding when you think of how you go to international conferences these days.
Yes, it's all changed. I remember when I was teaching in London, I think the travel budget for the entire department of about a dozen people was something like £1,000, which I think it would probably get you to a conference in Europe, but it certainly wouldn't have gotten you across the Atlantic. So.
Of course, Norway being a small academic community, we've always realized that it was important for us to go abroad to academic meetings. We couldn't just stay among ourselves in Norway or even in Scandinavia.
Yeah.
So, and I think that Norwegian research authorities, the Research Council of Norway and so on, they've always understood this. So there's been a certain amount of funding. And of course, after Norway become oil-producing country, the Norwegian delegations to international scientific meetings tend to be rather large.
That sort of takes me off in a slightly different direction, which is Scandinavia, because clearly Norway led the way into peace and conflict studies, research, whatever we're going to call it. But I have always had the impression that a lot of what happened in Sweden and Denmark was, perhaps one shouldn't use the word inspired, but let's use the word inspired, certainly encouraged by Norwegian institutions.
There was a lot of influence from Norway on the other Scandinavian countries. We had in the 1960s several week-long seminars, usually called theory weeks, where students and younger faculty would come from the other Nordic countries. And many of those people have later on become professors and central in the social sciences generally and in peace research specifically in the other Nordic countries. Håkan Wiberg, who was of course first professor of sociology in Lund and then director of the Copenhagen Peace Research Institute for many years. He was one of those who came regularly to those meetings. Peter Wallensten, who has been the instrumental, the key person in building up the Department of Peace and Conflict Research in Uppsala. Raimo Väyrynen, who was the head of the Tampere Peace Research Institute, and then of course later on had an academic career in the US as head of the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame. then went back to Finland to become head of the Finnish Research Council, and now, just a few days ago, assumed a new post as director of a new and much larger Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki.
Oh, that's what he's doing now, is it?
Right. So he's come back to research from research administration.
Yeah.
So all of these people came to these meetings and were, of course, influenced by them. And both Peter Wallensten, Raimo Väyrynen, and Håkan Wiberg, they all wrote their first academic articles in Journal of Peace Research. And indeed, it shows something of the spirit of the time, I think, that Peter Wallensten and Raimo Väyrynen, both of them were all of 23 when they published their first article in the journal. And if you go back, and particularly Peter Wallensten's article, it's still quite well cited. It's probably not his best cited article, but I know other people at the time who published work that they've had trouble exceeding in terms of exposure and citations and so on since then. So those were they were intellectually exciting times, and Johan Galtung was very good at encouraging people to start publishing early and don't put your stuff in the drawer, but
get it out there.
Get it out there.
Did you in those days, we're talking still at the time when the Cold War was very much alive, did you manage to make any kinds of contacts or did you get any kind of interest from the other side of what we used to call the Iron Curtain, from the Poles?
Yes, there was quite a bit of contact. One of the early projects was a project that was funded by UNESCO, I think, in the mid-1960s on attitudes to disarmament. And this was a three-nation study of Norway, France, and Poland. And of course, Poland had a particular tradition because Poland had very strong sociology, that the communists did not succeed or did not care to destroy entirely. Both a theoretical tradition and an empirical tradition. So this was a study with national surveys, nationally representative surveys. And so we ran analysis on nationally representative samples from these three countries. And that was the first case that I can remember where we could work on survey data from Eastern Europe. I remember at this time that there was also some discussion about surveys being conducted in the Soviet Union, but I don't remember any Western scholars actually having access to the raw data. That would have been much more sensitive. But in Poland, this was possible, and so there were several early articles from the late 1960s about attitudes to disarmament in these three countries. Another vehicle for contact with the East that was important in those days were the Pugwash conferences.
Yes, several people have mentioned them.
Yes, Pugwash, of course, was founded specifically as a political movement among scientists to try to bridge the gap between the two sides in the Cold War, and they held several. They always had good Eastern European representation at their meetings, and held several meetings in Eastern Europe. I remember going to meetings myself, although Pugwash was not my main arena, but many of my colleagues were active there, and I remember going to meetings in East Germany and other places in Eastern Europe. The International Peace Research Association, which was an association founded by peace researchers, of course, and in a sense our own international association, also held meetings in Eastern Europe and had Eastern European representation. Of course, the problem was that from many of these countries, only certain people would be allowed to come. I can remember a conference, this was later in 1983, a conference in Hungary. and that was, at the time, there was just the beginnings of an independent Hungarian peace movement that was acting without the authorization of the authorities. And they had some university students who were active in the peace movement, but also interested in peace research. But they were not allowed to officially participate in the IPRA conference in Győr in Hungary. But a lot of people had contact with them anyway.
Yeah.
So probably the most dramatic conference of that kind was the IPRA conference that was held in Karlovy Vary, earlier known as Karlsbad, in what is now the Czech Republic, in 1969.
Oh, as early
And
as
of
that.
course, this was, but this was, of course, less than a year after the crackdown on and the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. And but the authorities hadn't totally streamlined Czechoslovakia yet. Remember, there was a long period in Czechoslovakia after the Soviet invasion where, although the liberal communists lost power, they were still visible. So some of these people came to the IPRA meeting. I remember Jiří Hájek, who was foreign minister during the Prague Spring. He actually came for 1 or 2 days to the meeting.
So he was free enough to do that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to say that this was just at the time when this big ideological discussion between the right and the left was going on in peace research.
The peace research movement.
And so this was the very meeting when the young radicals were criticizing Galtung and Bolding for being liberals and not radicals. And in retrospect, I must say I find that a little bit tragic that we were meeting in the Czech Republic. We should have been interested in bridging the gaps and talking about what was going on in Eastern Europe and what this meant and so on. And in a sense, we were concentrating on our own squabbles. So that was a little bit sad.
Sad and ironic, actually, of course, as well.
Yes, quite ironic.
What about contacts with? I'm not sure whether I could properly use that expression, but in those days one talked about the third world. One of the things that a number of people have said about the peace research movement is that it tended to be not exactly. It didn't tend to neglect, outside of the Europe and North America. But if you look at the people who came to the conferences, and if you look at the people who were involved in peace research, it didn't, early on anyway, sort of embrace people on a global basis. Do you think that's fair, or do you think it's justifiable?
There's obviously something to that criticism, but I must say that
I don't think it's necessarily a criticism. I think it was said with regret on several occasions.
But I must say that for me personally at PRIO, it was a little bit the other way around. And that was partly because of Galtung teaching in Latin America, because he brought several students from Flaxo over to PRIO for a period. One of them was a Brazilian political science or sociology, political science student, Simon Schwarzman, who had been in jail after the military coup in Brazil. But when he was released, Galtung found some money to bring him to Oslo, and he worked at the institute for over a year. And then went on to do PhD studies in the US. Later on became head of the Brazilian Statistical Office. So he's had quite a prominent career in Brazil. And we had 2 Argentinians also from Flaxo and a Chilean. So there was a bit of contact with Latin America. And then we also developed a link with what's it called, Makerere College in Uganda, which had quite a strong sociology department. And I think at least 2 people from PRIO went there for a full year. Helge Wem, I think, went there for a year, and later on Per Olav Reinton. But of course that was destroyed with, well, certainly with Idi Amin, but possibly even before that. And we had students from Uganda visiting PRIO, and one of them, Tarsis Kabwegere, I think later on became Minister of Education. So the other institution that has done even more in this regard is the Department of Peace and Conflict Research in Uppsala. They've had a course funded by, but of course that started later. It probably started in the maybe 1980s. A course funded by Swedish Agency for International Development. Very extensive, I mean, mostly consisting of third world students.
Makerere is interesting because I had a colleague in London who was teaching at Makerere, I think when some of your people were down there, a fellow named Peter Willets.
Yes, I remember the name. I don't think I've actually met him, but
well, he certainly knew of you.
Tim Shaw, I think, was also there, and him I run into all the time because he comes to the International Studies Association meetings. I know him quite well.
There's one interesting omission, and again, this isn't a criticism because I think it's true of everywhere. I mean, particularly in view of the fact that when you were starting with Johan, you were interested in non-violence. You know, sort of in general, not just PRIO, a sort of distinct lack of contacts with India and with that tradition, which I've wondered about in the past because it was certainly true of my outfit in London. But did PRIO have any relations at all with any of the people in India who were pursuing non-violence or had been involved in that whole thing?
Yes, and the interest in the academic interest in non-violence in Norway actually goes back even a little earlier than Johan Galtung, because Arne Næss, who was probably Norway's most prominent philosopher, who's now, I just went to a party celebrating his 95th birthday.
Oh, he's is he still going strong?
Going strong may be exaggerating a little bit, but it's still very much
still
alert.
going.
And he gave a talk on the radio the same week that he had this birthday celebration. But he had worked on Gandhi's ethics and wrote an early article in Journal of Conflict Resolution on the systematization of Gandhian ethics, where he tried to classify, to extract specific norms from Gandhi's writings. And then he hired Galtung on a project on Gandhi, and the two of them together wrote a book on Gandhi's political ethics, which I think exists only in Norwegian. But then Gandhi, Arne Næss has written several things about Gandhi later on. And in the, probably in 1969, Galtung and Næss went together to, could have been Varanasi, to some institute of Gandhian studies, where they worked with Indian scholars on Gandhi. So that was, but there's not much left of that today. There was this took a slightly different direction in the 1980s, when we had a let me backtrack a little bit. The project that I was hired to work on in 1964, this is a project on non-violence as national defense.
Okay.
And remember, I went to a conference that Adam Roberts organized in Oxford.
That's right. He was working on this at the time, wasn't
yes,
he?
well, he still is. He's still interested in this,
Mm.
and which became a book, Politics of Nonviolent Action, or something.
Mm.
This was a very, very practical project in many ways.
Mm.
How can you integrate nonviolence into the traditional defense of the country, or can nonviolence even become an alternative, complete alternative to military defense? In a sense, what we found was that I think Norwegian authorities, like many other authorities, in fact had integrated a great deal of occupation resistance and so on into the national defense.
Yeah.
But it was all rather secret.
Well, one can see why, perhaps.
Yes, one can see why. But a classical example in Norway is that when Norway was invaded by the Germans on 9th of April 1940, Quisling, of course, later on became a synonymous for traitor,
Yes.
but he was actually a person, head of the Norwegian Nazi Party. He just marched up to the radio station, demanded to speak, and gave a speech to the nation. And they simply gave in with no resistance. Now, of course, if you'd had any kind of preparedness for occupation, the radio station would have been shut down and the government would be broadcasting from some secret location. And in fact, this is what happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968, in the first days after the Russian invasion. So I think in a sense, most defense ministries were doing this in one way or the other, but they certainly didn't think of it as non-violence, and they weren't particularly interested in talking to peace researchers or to the peace movement about this. Then in the 1980s, it took a slightly different turn, because then many people developed ideas about non-offensive defense and non-offensive
defense. Yeah.
But this would not necessarily be non-violent. It might be military, it might have a non-violent component, but it might be military, but the idea was not to have offensive weapons. Defend your own territory, but not in a way that seems threatening to your neighbor or your opponent.
Yeah.
Even to the point where you might argue for, okay, you can have missiles, but they shouldn't have a very long range, so they can't reach the opponent's territory. And in the last 5 to 10 years, perhaps, of the Cold War, this was quite an important topic for discussion. And it drew to some extent on the nonviolent tradition, and many of the people who had been advocates of nonviolent defense were active in that discussion about non-offensive defense. Anders Boserup, who was active in peace research in Denmark, was one of the people who's written on both those topics.
Yes, I remember Anders writing a book with an old friend of mine, Andy Mack.
That's right.
A very small, thin
yes,
book,
it's still one of the best books on non-violent defense, I think.
Yes.
I wanted to add one thing when you talked about the third world, or whatever one should call it these days.
Developing countries, whatever.
We've had a course in peace research at the International Summer School at the University of Oslo. And that used to be called the American Summer School in Norway. And it was aimed at students generally called Hansen and Olsen, who came from the Midwest and were of Norwegian origin. But as there were fewer of these students, and particularly fewer who were interested in being sent by their parents to the
old country.
The University of Oslo thought that they needed a new idea, because otherwise the summer school would disappear. And so they went to the Norwegian Agency for International Development and got a lot of funding for students from developing countries. So the I'd say over half, perhaps 2/3 of the students
now come
in the summer
from-
school now come from third world countries. And we've had a peace research course within the summer school from 1969.
Oh, so it
So
goes
it's been
back
going
that far.
for 37 years.
Long time.
And that's one exposure that we have regularly to students from that part of the world.
So, sort of non-violence, disarmament studies. I mean, I can see a very strong connection with Norwegian history and experience and sort of interest in those particular topics. Were there any other themes which you think were particularly selected because of PRIO being in Norway and Norway being in Scandinavia? There's always been this feeling, I think, from outside the Scandinavian countries that Scandinavian peace research is different. And I'm still trying to put my finger on what exactly the difference is. I've got a feeling that is that the sense of difference is right, but I'm not quite sure what it is. Would you?
I think one of the topics that many people were quite interested in was the question of neutrality and non-alignment.
Yeah.
Because Sweden, of course, has had a consistently non-aligned tradition even throughout the Cold War. Although, as historians dig deeper into the archives, they find that there is more
I've seen that.
cooperation between military cooperation. But at the political level, Sweden was consistently non-aligned. And Norway was non-aligned for the first 35 years of its existence as an independent nation, since 1905 up to the German invasion in 1940. But of course, since Norway was occupied during World War II and Sweden wasn't, that was one reason why they went in different directions afterwards. In a sense, you can say that politicians always try to fight the previous war, and the Norwegian lesson from World War II was that we can't stand alone. And this was one of the big controversial issues in Norwegian politics, the whole alignment with the West and so on. Although Norway never fully embraced everything the Americans were doing. Norway was probably decisive in preventing Spain from becoming a member of NATO until after Franco's death.
Oh, that's a connection.
You've probably forgotten that Spain wasn't a member of NATO, because one thinks of Spain as
yes,
having been a member of NATO, but it wasn't. It had a bilateral agreement with the US.
That's right. Of course, I'd forgotten that.
But the Americans were quite annoyed. But Norway, because of the Norwegian involvement on the Republican side, civilian aid to the Spanish Republic and so on.
Field's always claimed to be multidisciplinary. Do you think that that's a good word to describe it? And if so, what do you think the field has actually borrowed from other places or other disciplines that were important concepts or important ideas that were fruitfully followed up during your time in those early days? What do you think has been important?
I mentioned that sociology was, I think, the key discipline in the very early years in the 1960s. But if you look at peace research today, it's very much dominated by political science. And you can see that in terms of the academic background of people who write for the peace research journals and so on. I think the cross-disciplinary element has been maintained, that we're still getting inputs from geography, economics, law. Recently, in the discussion of civil war, the whole greed versus grievance debate largely has come from economists. And while I think that in many ways a great simplification, it's still been useful to provoke debate about the nature of civil war. International law has probably also been influential. The emphasis on human rights, discussions about humanitarian intervention, and so on have been inspired, I think, by people from international law. But when I said before that I'm not sure peace research is a discipline, the idea was that that peace research would move from being cross-disciplinary to becoming transdisciplinary, and then would have established its own discipline. And I think Johan Galtung would probably say that has happened. But you should ask him about that, or look at his webpage.
Right. But you don't think, you seem to imply you don't think it has, so where have we fallen short?
I don't think it has. I mean, there are some very successful peace studies departments, not too many, but a few, and the one in Uppsala is very, very successful in terms of building a range of teaching programs from the starting undergraduate level all the way up to the PhD, and they're turning out excellent PhD candidates now regularly. But all of them could have got their degree in the political science department, or most of them, maybe one or two would have been in other disciplines. But they are not that distinctively different. And of course they many of them publish in standard political science or international relations journals. But in one sense, I think this is one of the strengths, that the study of war and peace has become accepted into the mainstream of the disciplines. So there are many people working on war and peace without necessarily considering themselves peace researchers, and I think that's good. I don't think we should be exclusive. And so when I go to conferences like the International Studies Association, and I hear excellent papers on civil war and so on, and by people who do not consider themselves peace researchers, or if you ask them, they might say peace researcher. Yeah, I guess maybe so, or haven't thought about it, or and I consider that a victory, because when I was a student, I mean, there weren't that many people studying these issues, and that's why you needed to start separate institutions, separate journals, and so on.
So you seem to be saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, that the discipline, or field, if we're going to call it, not a discipline, of peace research has in fact influenced these other disciplines rather more than they have influenced it?
It's a mutual influence, of course, because our methods and our theoretical concepts and so on, they all come from somewhere. So we've read them in textbooks or monographs or articles from the conventional disciplines. But we've certainly been an influence back in setting priorities for the traditional disciplines. And I think it's very interesting that the International Studies Association, where I'm now the president-elect, if you go back and look at the past presidents of that association, you find that most of them, almost all of them, have written on war and peace. Because that's it's recognized as an extremely important and legitimate issue, whereas 4 years ago people are saying that peace, you can't really study peace. It's
Yes, I've heard that one.
yes, I'm sure you have.
Yeah.
You all have.
Yeah. Looking at it from a slightly different point of view, though, one of the things that sort of strikes me is if we take the field of peace and conflict studies, what's that lovely phrase out of Don Quixote about he mounted his hobby horse and galloped off in all directions?
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that particularly in recent years the field's subdivided itself and become much more complicated and much more, we now talk about studying peacekeeping or peacemaking or peace building or conflict transformation, conflict resolution, conflict settlement. You know all of the phrases. Do you think, looking back into the 1960s, it's become a very diverse field. Do you think people anticipated that when they started? I mean, they seem to have, from what you were saying, being focused on.
I think the diversity that you point to has to do with the fact that there are so many more people are doing it, and that the field is more highly developed. But I don't think it's necessarily a question of subfields that are not talking to each other. I think there was a greater danger in the wake of the launching of the concept of structural violence, when peace research wanted to demonstrate its relevance to development studies, to the North conflict, not just the East-West conflict. And it was a broader agenda. There were several fields that were doing this. I mean, you saw the same thing in human rights studies. There was the first, second, and third generation of human rights. Kenneth Boulding once used the phrase human betterment research. So, every good goal could be subsumed under human rights or under peace if you were a peace researcher. And I think that to some extent led to a delusion and loss of direction. And I can remember that there were people who wanted to work at PRIO who came with some projects where they wrote structural violence on the first page, and then they went on to discuss whatever they were interested in, and then they would go back to structural violence. Any real or perceived injustice could be seen as structural violence, and therefore be defined as part of peace research. And I think that was unfortunate, and I think now there's been more of a concentration, perhaps to some extent back to the original agenda. What are the patterns of violence? How can we decrease violence? How can we build stable, peaceful societies? And I think that remains the core agenda of peace research. And whether some people then are concentrating on the onset of conflict, some are concentrating on the duration of conflict, some are concentrating on the settlement of conflict, and some are concentrating on the post-conflict period. There may be that specialization, but these are not totally disparate fields.
Okay, well that's answered my next question in anticipation. So, again, I think this is at a slight tangent, but nonetheless, maybe talked about key figures. You've mentioned Johan, of course, and Kenneth Boulding. Who else? Who do you think some of the seminal figures have been in the development of the field? And what do you think their major contributions were?
Well, I would mention both the Bouldings, actually, both Kenneth and Elise Boulding. In fact, when PRIO moved about a year and a half ago, we had a competition for naming the different meeting rooms and common rooms at PRIO, and some of us suggested to name them after the pioneers of the field. We didn't quite get that, but we got one area which is called Pioneers Hall, where there will be pictures of these people, and so Kenneth and Elise Boulding were some of the people we suggested. Not Johan Galtung actually, because we went for the people who were even older than Johan Galtung, sort of that preceded Johan Galtung into the discipline. And Lise's contribution was in part organizational, because she played an important role in the foundation of IPRA, and later on became Secretary General of IPRA,
yes.
but also for linking peace research with women's studies, and introducing the topic of gender and peace. Karl Deutsch, I would say, is another seminal figure. And again, I had the great fortune when that year I went to the University of Michigan, and Dave Singer had this. He had a seminar at the Mental Health Research Institute. He had a half appointment in the department and half appointment at Mental Health. So he ran the Correlates of War projects out of the Mental Health Research Institute in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And Karl Deutsch was a consultant to that program, so he came in quite regularly.
So you met him?
Yes, and of course his big contribution was this idea of security communities, and how nations become so tied together that war becomes virtually unthinkable. And this was very different from the traditional realist ideas about military alliances, a balance of power, and so on. And he may have been a little ahead of his time, although he was certainly a big figure in his time. But recently, I mean, you get a lot of people now writing about these things, and the whole liberal peace discussion and so on is very much related to Karl Deutsch's ideas. Of course, Bruce Russett, who is one of the key figures of the ideas of liberal peace, a peace resting on joint democracy, international organization, and economic cooperation. He was a student of Karl Deutsch and worked with him when he was a young scholar. So that's one very important figure that I would...
yes, it's interesting how his security community idea has sort of come back, because... Yes,
very much so, and become even more important after the end of the Cold War, I think. In the International Studies Association, there is actually a Karl Deutsch award to celebrate his memory, sort of for younger scholars within 10 years of their dissertation.
But it is nice that he gets remembered that way, but it's also very nice that he gets remembered because people are beginning to use his ideas again.
Very much so, very much so. And same thing with Richardson that I mentioned. I mean, we were constantly going back to him. Quincy Wright, I think, is somewhat a little bit less directly relevant, because his war data, which were important when he published them, have been superseded by the Correlates of War project and more recently the Uppsala Prio conflict data and so on. Now who else? Another person that I thought was very important was Anatole Rappaport, who of course died just
about a month ago.
About a month ago.
Yeah, just before Christmas. Maybe.
Of course, he came from a different background. I guess he was a mathematical biologist or something by training, but had a very diverse background, also a concert pianist.
That's right, yes. He could have been a concert pianist, I remember.
And he was also at the University of Michigan when I was there, so I
at the
had
same
great
time.
fortune to meet him too. And of course he introduced some early ideas about networks, and also of course wrote about arms races and helped to edit Richardson's volumes.
Yes.
And has written about conflict resolution. I mean, he's covered a broad range of topics in peace research.
Yes, we missed him. We had him on our list for interviewing, but we tried to get an appointment with him, but his wife said probably it's too late. And we're very sorry about that, because I remember reading Fights, Games and Debates many years ago and thinking,
Yes,
hey, this
yes,
is
that was a very important very important book. Rappaport, of course, was politically very engaged too. I mean, he left the U.S. because of the Vietnam War.
Yes, somebody he went to Canada, stayed in Canada.
Well, he actually went first to Denmark.
Did he?
But I'm not sure if this story is real or apocryphal, but he was in Denmark for a year or two. But then somebody said he was cheated on some house deal, and so he got fed up with Denmark. And then he went to Canada and spent the rest of his life in Toronto. But normally you wouldn't expect. I mean, he had a tenured position in a major university in the U.S.
Sure, And he went to Copenhagen with Håkon, or just went to Denmark?
No. This was before the Copri. So now he taught for a year or two at the I think the Technical University of Copenhagen, and it was probably his game theory that brought him to their attention. But he was so famous he could have been hired almost anywhere, I guess.
Yeah. So. Anybody else that sort of influenced you particularly?
Right. I'm sure I'm going to think about some more names tomorrow. But,
of course, probably when you're halfway to DC.
Yes, that's right. Well, as I said, we were a very closely knit group of graduate students. In the mid 1960s,
Yeah.
So certainly I've been very influenced by people like Peter Wallensten and Håkan Wiberg and Raimo Väyrynen, and I would hope that it's mutual. I'm sure there must have been other more senior people, but.
Well, as we say, you'll probably think of them on the way to back into town. All right, one other thing about our field is that it says, and I think with some justification, it's always attempted to be practical and applied, and ideas should be taken out into the real world, and we try to affect conflicts and help to create peace. I think that was one of the original ideas. Looking back, how successful do you think we've been in that?
Well, that's hard to say. I think we have. I think we've contributed to an improved understanding of the world around us, but whether we have contributed any specific ideas that you can point to as powerful enough to change the world, I don't know. If we had, perhaps there would be some Nobel Prizes awarded to peace researchers. I've looked back at the list of people who've been awarded the Peace Prize, and the closest you come to people in peace research is probably some people who contributed to international law. Then there's Norman Angell, of course, who in retrospect was a precursor of the idea of the liberal peace, the commercial peace, in a sense. Although it seemed at the time that he got it all wrong, because he first published his book in 1911, saying that war had become impossible, and then you got World War III within 3 years, and then he republished it in, I think, a new edition in 1935, and got the Peace Prize the next year or the year after, and then you got World War II. So,
bad timing.
But many people are now saying that well, he was basically right, but he was just a little bit early. He was describing trends where countries were changing from being warfare states to being trading states in Richard Rosencrantz's terms. And that the commercial spirit was more important than the military conquering spirit. But these trends weren't quite strong enough to prevent the forces behind World War I and World War II. But following those wars, that new spirit has become more and more important. And that this is part of the reason why today we see a decline in the number of armed conflicts and the number of casualties in conflict, in spite of all the terrible things that are going on in the world. I mean, we would like the number of ongoing armed conflicts to be zero. It is 30, but it's still
less than it was.
We're not seeing anything like World War I or World War II. Of course, had we had World War III, we would have had another peak on the on the curve. But I think the idea of the democratic peace and the liberal peace and so on is one powerful idea that's come out of the peace research community. Certainly not accepted by all peace researchers. Still controversial, and the source of a great deal of ongoing debate and research.
What about the direct application of theories and ideas by people who create them? I'm thinking particularly about people like Johan, for example, because there are several of them. I mean, I'm thinking Johan Herb Kelman, people who've tried to take ideas and apply them directly. Do you think there have been any successes, very broadly conceived, in that?
Yeah, now you mentioned Herbert Kelman, it's perhaps another name I should have mentioned before. And I was actually on the academic jury when he was awarded the Grawemeyer Award, which is a big award for new ideas in international order or something. And I remember saying to myself that one reason why I'm voting for his work, it's the basis of written work, is that somebody who's able to sit down with seemingly totally unreasonable people for 30 years and talk to them and try to get them to come to terms with each other really deserves an award. And I really admire people who are able to engage in this way with parties to a conflict. Personally, I don't have that patience. I could never do it. I'd get impatient and bang the table and leave before anything useful was accomplished. And I'm not always sure that necessarily researchers may be the best people to do this. There may be a school of practitioners who can do it as effectively as researchers. But I certainly think that the conflict resolution, the research community has contributed to our understanding of ways in which this can be done. But if, for instance, if you look at the Oslo process in the Middle East, which of course now is in tatters and seems to be a failure, but which at the time nevertheless was a breakthrough. You actually did manage to get the parties to, who had never talked to each other before, to sit down and talk to each other and conclude some kind of agreement. But this was done by people who didn't really have an academic background in conflict resolution.
No.
But had a good intuitive understanding of what it took to get people to talk to each other.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about that, going off at another tangent, is that we managed to get to talk to Rod Larsen and to his wife just after they'd sort of concluded the agreement. They were both staying down at the Watergate, and we managed to sort of get an hour with them. I think the interesting thing about that is that they'd established, or at least the credibility of FAFO had been sort of established by doing something which is quite unrelated to peace work, to getting parties together, but they'd actually sort of built up this credibility in Gaza.
Yes, by doing this level of living.
That's right, by doing that study.
Yes.
And it sort of struck me that on several occasions I've come across something similar, which is that there's an organization from outside the war-torn society, which is in the war-torn society, doing something which has got nothing to do with peace, but it develops a sense of trust and credibility across the adversary lines. And if they're looking around for somebody to act as an interlocutor or an intermediary, they sort of say, okay, well, how about these guys? They're doing something useful here. Maybe they can help us out. Whereas a lot of the people who go in there and sort of say, I'm here to help you resolve your conflicts.
Right. I know that many people now talk about environmental conflict resolution in that perspective. That if you have problems about environmental degradation or sharing a joint resource, such as a cross-boundary river or whatever, there are all kinds of practical problems that have to be solved. And so many people in the environmental field think that this can be a useful vehicle to establishing cooperation, which can then be extended to the more directly political problems. And I think that's a promising avenue, although I sometimes tell my friends in the environmental conflict community that environmental cooperation is fine, but there are probably other forms of cooperation too, which can generate the same results, such as engaging in level of living studies, as FAFO did in the Middle East. I have to add about Terry Larson. Of course, he's now head of the International Peace Academy in New York.
Oh, that's okay.
So he's engaged in commissioning sort of policy relevant studies on peace-related issues. But he is an extremely shrewd operator.
Oh yeah,
shrewd political operator.
Yes, we got that impression as well, just sort of talking to.
So there's a strong personal quality there that was important.
Yeah. Okay. Thinking about the field again and going back to its early days. Do you think that, now thinking about the hopes and dreams that people had of the field at that time, which were very optimistic, do you think we've fallen short of some of the original hopes and dreams? What do you think the young Nils Petter looking at the field now would think of? What have we accomplished? What have we not done?
First of all, I think I would be a little bit cautious about assuming that everybody had exactly the same goals. I think one of the successes of peace research in the early days was to establish yourself as an exciting intellectual community. So some people probably came to it just for that reason, and may not have had any great hopes and visions for the world, but came to it because it was an exciting place to be and to study and to do research. But
okay, point taken. Yes.
But for those of us who were also perhaps more politically motivated, I think I certainly think for me personally that the study of war and peace has become more widespread and more successful than I could have hoped for. Maybe there were some. I mean, I didn't go into peace research and expect eternal peace to break out all over the world in a matter of decades. Although I sometimes like to say that I'm a little bit inspired by one of my uncles who was a medical doctor and who was one of Norway's leading tuberculosis experts. And he had the satisfaction of seeing, towards the end of his career, one institution after another being closed behind him because there was virtually no tuberculosis left. So he had essentially devoted his life to wiping out a disease in Norway. And that must have been extremely satisfactory. But it wasn't as if he had wiped out disease generally. No. I think with some justification we can say that the traditional interstate war, where one country tries to conquer another country and extend its own territory, that form of war has almost disappeared. You still have military interventions, of course, that we see most prominently in Iraq. But it's not as if the US is in Iraq to make it the 51st, 52nd, whatever state.
52nd, I think.
So there's still violence, there's still conflict, there's still aggression. But the traditional form of interstate war has almost disappeared. Most violence today is, of course, intra-state war, and sometimes fueled by other countries intervening in the internal violence. And that's still a very serious problem. But perhaps we can say that perhaps I can retire by saying that one form of violence disappeared in my lifetime, but I can't quite say with my uncle that I'm positive that I contributed to wiping it out. But I'd like to think that we've made some small contribution anyway.
Okay.
But I know that not all peace researchers are equally optimistic. We have a debate going with the people from the Correlates of War project who tend to say that war is constant and that it's just shifting through different forms.
Shifting
and so
its
on.
form.
But I don't agree with that, and I think their own data show that the number of battle deaths in these different forms of conflict, colonial war, interstate war, intrastate war, and so on, are in fact declining, with many spikes on the curve, including a current spike in Iraq.
Okay.
Of course, if you were living in Iraq, it may not seem this way.
Yes, right. There's a British minister, I think it may have been Minister of Labour, who once made the comment that if you're unemployed, if you don't have a job, the unemployment rate is 100%.
Yes, precisely.
Again, looking back, anything that, looking back over the development of the field, anything that surprised you, has astonished you, in the sense that I never anticipated that was going to happen? Good things or bad things, positive or negative?
Well, I certainly have to say that I was surprised by the end of the Cold War. I know that some people claim that they predicted the end of the Cold War, including my old mentor Johan Galtung, and I've actually looked at Johan's work to try to find out where he predicted the end of the Cold War, and the only thing I could find was an article he wrote back in after the crackdown on solidarity in Poland in 1980, 81, where he said that something like this may have strengthened the Warsaw Pact and perhaps even the Soviet Union or something. I didn't feel that was quite predicting the end of the Cold War. Maybe there's something I've missed, but I did actually compile Johan Galtung's bibliography on his 50th birthday. So
you've covered most of the stuff.
I thought I was reasonably familiar with his writings. But to most people that came as a big surprise. Not because not because we thought that the Soviet Union seemed like a great success, but because it seemed so powerful.
Yeah.
And so our entire discussion was in terms of how can we reach an accommodation with the Soviet Union? How can we make, how can we prevent, reduce the danger of nuclear war? How can we make life more bearable for the citizens of these countries? How can we increase contact with people, not just through official channels, but unofficially? And then suddenly to see this whole system coming unraveled, to me, was a surprise. In retrospect, I can always come up with several reasons why it happened, but
I think in this country they call it Monday morning quarterbacking, which is...
That's right, that's right.
Yeah.
And to some extent, you could say that the fall of apartheid in South Africa, I won't, that didn't surprise me in the same way, but it surprised me that it happened so comparatively peacefully.
Yeah.
I would have expected a much greater probability of a really bloody civil war. And the same thing, of course, goes for the dissolution of the Soviet Empire too, that once it started happening, there was great fear that it would lead to violence. And I think that has called for some re-examination about how we understand the world. So, of course, always a danger that when something like that happens, you then think that extremely drastic changes are going to happen all the time. Whereas perhaps they won't. Perhaps we will go into go back into a much more stable situation. Of course, the biggest challenge now is what happens in China. I mean, China clearly is in a process of transformation, and has transformed much more successfully than the Soviet Union ever did into an economic success. And a trading state in Rosecrans terms. But it has not come very far in the political tradition. It's still, in political transition, it's still a very rigid system, very little individual freedom, and so on. And if that does not take a peaceful direction, then we could be in for a very unpleasant surprise.
Yeah. So could many people in China, of course. Yeah. Okay, let's change the tense. Let's look forward. Let's ask, what do you think are likely to be future lines of development for peace research over the next decade or so? What do you think where do you think we're going?
Well, I think one of the important areas now is to somewhat broaden our conception of violence. Not going all the way back to that period when we were all talking about structural violence, because I think that was too broad. But looking beyond the traditional interstate and government conflicts, civil wars between the government and rebel movements and so on. If these types of conflicts are declining, what are the other types of violence that we should be concerned with? And certainly extreme human rights violations. What the Uppsala Conflict Data Project called one-sided violence, which is not violence between two organized parties, but violence by a government against its citizens, is one extremely important form of violence. And in fact, in the 20th century, more people died from one-sided violence than from war. So this has always been a big challenge. I mean, the Holocaust, the purges in the Soviet Union, in China, and so on.
Mm.
So, but again, we don't perhaps have equally good statistics for the precise development of that over time.
Mm.
But again, my impression is that that is also actually declining in the same way that battle deaths in war are
Also going down.
are declining. If we look at perhaps the worst disaster of the 20th century, the Great Leap Forward in China, where forced industrialization and government a lack of concern about what was happening to people led to the death of perhaps 30 or 40 million. I mean, these are figures that the Chinese officially will admit to now.
Yeah.
There's really nothing to match that. And although we've had terrible cases of violence in Rwanda and now in Darfur and so on, again, they're not matching these disasters, and developments in China now are, as I said, relatively peaceful. Another area that we should be concerned with is the indirect effects of war. I've been talking about the decline in battle deaths, but of course those are the direct effects of battle, not just on military but on civilians too. But in addition, war has long-term effects because it destroys the economic infrastructure. Creates health problems, may destroy part of the educated elite, which makes it difficult to rebuild afterwards, and creates environmental problems. You leave landmines behind and so on, which will kill people for a long time. All of these things we are much more difficult to measure than the direct battle deaths. And it may be that because more wars, or a higher proportion of the ongoing wars now are civil wars in poor countries, that the indirect effects are proportionally somewhat greater than the direct effects. I still don't think that this changes the broad picture of a decline in conflict and the attendant decline in violence from conflict, but it modifies the picture quite a bit. And it's interesting that organizations like the WHO and so on, they're slowly beginning to take more of an interest in conflict and seeing war as a public health problem.
Yes, conflict is a health problem. Yeah.
Yes, which in a sense is quite obvious. Why didn't anyone call it a public health problem before? Well, the reason why it wasn't called a public health problem was that it was too political. So there was a fear that this would politicize WHO and similar organizations. And of course, during the Cold War, one side or the other could always prevent these organizations from entering into those politicized areas.
All right. Let me change gear again and go back to the field as it developed, because we've tended to approach this whole project of parents of the field by very much sort of looking at individual figures who were important and who were first generation or carried on that work. And we're beginning to realize that we have talked to a lot of people from North America. We talked to a lot of people from the Scandinavian countries. We've talked to some people in Britain. But nobody from France, nobody from Italy, nobody from Germany, nobody from the Netherlands. And this may simply be our neglect, but nothing in the early days seems to have developed in those places. Is that an inaccurate picture? I mean, looking back, were the generators of the field just North America, just Scandinavia?
It's not a completely accurate picture. Certainly, one of the pioneers in peace research was a Dutch international relations scholar, Bert Röhrling, who was I think he was a judge in the International Tribunal in Tokyo, the War Crimes Tribunal in Tokyo, after World War II, and became professor of international law in Groningen in the Netherlands, but had either the chair was changed or he got established a new chair in what was called polymology. Another name for peace.
Right. Yeah, somebody was trying to make it Irenology at one stage, I remember. Did you ever come across Irenology?
Yes, that's right.
Sorry, but
the word polymology was also used in French, polymologie.
Yeah.
And there was a man whose work I'm not well acquainted with, Gaston Boutol, who wrote something about polymology in France.
Yeah.
But Röhrling was an important figure in the institutional history of peace research because he was the first Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association. And he established the Polymological Institute at the University of Groningen. Now, I don't think he was intellectually as important to the field as Galtung, Bolding, and Deutsch, or Singer. And that may partly because he came from an international law background and the social sciences were more centrally important to peace research. So that's one country. Germany, there's certainly been a great deal of active peace research in Germany, and you might want to talk to people like Dieter Zenghaas, Klaus-Jürgen Gantzel. He's retired now from the University of Hamburg. He was professor of political science, but clearly a self-identified peace researcher. Eckhard Krippendorf to some extent.
Yeah.